you know. It's completely our own world. And we like to swim in the deepest waters and fly.
They had put a fart machine into my sleeping bag.
This hall echoes.
And Michael Gambon had actually been pressing it during the take, I found out.
It's almost impossible to imagine anyone other than Daniel Radcliffe as Harry Potter. For millions of people, he didn't just play the boy who lived. He became him. The round glasses, the lightning scar, that unmistakable voice. For an entire generation, when someone says Harry Potter, there's only one face that comes to mind. And that's exactly why this story is so difficult to believe. Because if you had walked into Warner Bros. During the early days of production, you wouldn't have found confidence. You would have found panic.
And we had a casting director in London who was getting pretty frustrated with me. She said, we need to find a Harry Potter. She was feeling pressure from the studio, and I was consistently saying no.
For months, the biggest fantasy movie ever attempted had one enormous problem. No Harry Potter. Not the wrong Harry. No Harry at all. The filmmakers weren't looking for a child actor. They were looking for someone who could convince millions of readers that this was the boy they'd imagined for years. Someone ordinary enough to disappear into the role, yet memorable enough to carry an entire franchise on his shoulders. And every child they met was missing something. Some were too polished, some felt too confident, some simply didn't feel real.
We looked at hundreds of tapes.
Think about that for a second. Hundreds of people were already building sets, costumes were being designed, concept artists were bringing Hogwarts to life. One of the biggest productions in Hollywood was moving forward, without its main character. The clock wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was moving faster, and with every passing week, the pressure only grew, because this wasn't just another movie, it was Harry Potter, and the entire world was waiting. Thousands of children wanted the role. Many of them looked the part. Some had already acted professionally. Others arrived believing this would change their lives. But every audition ended the same way. Close, but not Harry. Again and again and again. The search stretched on for months. Eventually, it became something nobody wanted to admit out loud. What if the perfect Harry Potter simply didn't exist? Then, completely by accident, everything changed. Finding Harry Potter should have been the easiest part. At least, that's what everyone thought. The books had already become a phenomenon. Millions of children wanted the role. Thousands were willing to audition. On paper, it sounded simple. Find a talented British boy with dark hair. Give him a pair of round glasses, and let the magic do the rest. Reality couldn't have been more different. Because Harry Potter wasn't just the main character, he was the entire movie. If audiences didn't believe Harry, they wouldn't believe Hogwarts. They wouldn't believe Hagrid. They wouldn't believe any of it. Everything depended on one child.
Well, Dan, there was this nationwide sort of search, obviously, worldwide search.
So the auditions began. Children arrived from all over Britain. Some had years of acting experience. Others had never stepped in front of a camera before. Every single one of them believed they had a chance. For the casting team, every new audition came with hope. Maybe this was him. Maybe the search was finally over. But after every screen test, the answer stayed the same. No, not because they were bad. Many of them were genuinely talented. They just weren't Harry. And that's a much harder problem to solve. How do you cast someone the entire world has already imagined? Every reader had a different version of Harry Potter inside their head. Now, one 11-year-old boy had to become all of them. That pressure was almost impossible to satisfy. Weeks turned into months. The budget kept growing. Entire departments continued working. Meanwhile, the one person they needed most still hadn't walked through the door.
It was interminable, looking and looking and looking and not finding.
Looking back now, it's tempting to believe the filmmakers always knew Daniel Radcliffe was out there somewhere, waiting to be discovered. But that's not how this story happened, because when they finally found the boy who felt exactly right, they almost let him slip away, long before Hogwarts, before movie premieres, before magazine covers. Daniel Radcliffe was just another kid growing up in London. He wasn't chasing blockbuster movies. He wasn't trying to become the face of a generation. In fact, Harry Potter wasn't even supposed to happen. Daniel had acted before, just enough to convince people he had something special. A small TV role here, another opportunity there. Nothing that suggested he was about to become one of the most recognizable actors in the world, and certainly nothing that suggested Hollywood was looking for him, because it wasn't. While thousands of children were lining up for auditions, Daniel wasn't standing in those lines. His path into Harry Potter would be completely different, and that's exactly why almost nobody saw it coming. Not the audience, not the press, not even Daniel himself.
And I paid very little attention to the play. I was always looking at my shoulder at the boy behind, and he just had this quality which was an old soul in a young body.
Sometimes casting directors spend months searching for the perfect actor. Other times, they meet someone, and within minutes, they simply know. That was the feeling beginning to spread through the production. For the first time since the search had started, someone finally felt right. There was only one problem. Feeling right wasn't enough.
I got about 6 of him.
At first, it almost felt too good to be true. After months of searching, after seeing countless auditions, the filmmakers had finally met a boy who didn't seem like he was trying to play Harry Potter. He simply felt like him, not because he was louder or funnier or more experienced than everyone else. Quite the opposite. There was something unusually natural about him. He wasn't performing, he was just being. And sometimes that's the hardest thing for an actor to do. For the first time since production began, the search finally had a direction. The producers were excited, the director was convinced. Even the people who had spent months watching audition tapes started to believe the search was over. There was just one problem. Nobody had asked Daniel's parents, because saying yes to Harry Potter wasn't like saying yes to a normal movie. This wasn't a few weeks on a film set. It wasn't even one film. If everything worked, Daniel's entire childhood would change. School, friends, privacy. Growing up, every part of his life would suddenly belong to the biggest movie franchise in the world. That's not a decision most parents make overnight.
My mum and dad both went, no, that's far too much of an upheaval of his life. So that we can't let that happen.
And they were cautious, very cautious. Not because they doubted Daniel, but because they understood something Hollywood often forgets. Childhood doesn't come with a second take.
We really have a lot of respect for parents, and we'd like you to come in for a meeting.
For a while, it genuinely looked like they might say no. And if they did, the search would begin all over again. Imagine finally solving the biggest problem in your movie, only to discover you haven't solved it at all. The people behind Harry Potter knew exactly what was at stake. Finding another talented child wasn't impossible. Finding another Daniel might be, so instead of moving on, they waited, they talked, they answered questions. They tried to convince Daniel's parents that this wasn't just another Hollywood production, that their son would be protected, that his education would matter, that his life wouldn't simply disappear behind studio gates. Those promises mattered, because without them, there might never have been a Daniel Radcliffe in Hogwarts robes.
Ironically, our producer, David Heyman, was at the theater sitting in front of Dan and his father. At intermission, David approached Dan's father.
Eventually, something changed, not overnight, not because of one dramatic speech, but because trust slowly replaced uncertainty. Daniel's parents began to believe that the people making Harry Potter actually cared about the child behind the character. And that changed everything. The moment the glasses went on, the moment the Hogwarts robes were fitted, the search that had consumed months of production was finally over. Harry Potter had been found, or at least that's what everyone believed. Because choosing Harry turned out to be the easy part. Keeping him would become a completely different challenge. If you ask the people who made Harry Potter why Daniel Radcliffe got the role, very few of them talk about acting. They don't mention technique or experience or training. Instead, they all seem to describe the same feeling. Daniel didn't look like a child pretending to be Harry Potter. He looked like Harry Potter pretending to be an ordinary child, and those are two very different things.
Again, it captured that haunted quality. He delivered that line as if he had lived, 60 years or something. And it was improbable that an 11-year-old could have that kind of complexity in a performance.
Watch the first film again. Not for the magic, not for Hogwarts. Watch Daniel. He's surprisingly quiet. He doesn't dominate scenes. He listens, he reacts, he hesitates. Sometimes he doesn't even say anything at all. And somehow, those silent moments tell you exactly who Harry is. That's incredibly difficult for any actor. It's almost impossible for an 11-year-old. Most child actors perform emotions. Daniel often experienced them. The difference is subtle. But audiences can feel it, even if they don't know why. There was something else, something nobody could audition for. Chemistry. You can cast 3 brilliant actors and still end up with 3 strangers, or you can put 3 ordinary kids in a room and somehow create lifelong friends. No one can predict that. The filmmakers certainly couldn't. They got lucky, very lucky. Looking back, it's easy to call it perfect casting back then. It felt much more like a gamble, and that's because nobody knew what would happen next, not even Daniel. Here's the part of the story people rarely think about. Casting Harry Potter wasn't about making one successful movie. It meant choosing someone who would spend the next decade growing up in front of millions of people. Every awkward phase, every growth spurt, every change in his voice, every mistake, every success. The audience would see all of it. There was no guarantee Daniel would still feel like Harry 2 films later. Never mind 8. That had never really been tested before on this scale.
When you were a kid running around in a schoolboy's outfit, you don't feel particularly cool. But having grown up now, I go like, oh no, that was a very, very cool thing to be a part of.
Children change, sometimes almost overnight. The shy 11-year-old who walks onto a film set might become a completely different person by 13 or 15 or 17. The filmmakers weren't just betting on who Daniel was, they were betting on who he would become. That's a terrifying decision when your entire franchise depends on it. Somehow the gamble kept paying off. Film after film, Daniel grew older, Harry grew older. And somehow, the audience accepted both. That almost never happens. Usually, one grows faster than the other. By the end of the first movie, people believed Daniel was Harry Potter. By the end of the last, many people couldn't imagine separating the two. And that's when the casting story truly ended. Not on the day he signed the contract, not on the first day of filming, but years later, when nobody could remember what Harry Potter looked like before Daniel Radcliffe. The strange thing about perfect casting is that you usually don't notice it. Not while it's happening. Think back to the very first time you watched Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. You probably weren't analyzing Daniel Radcliffe's performance. You weren't wondering whether another actor could have done a better job. You were too busy believing in Hogwarts, believing in magic, believing that this shy little boy had somehow wandered into a world that was far bigger than he was. And that's exactly why the casting worked. The performance never asked for your attention. It quietly earned your trust. Daniel didn't try to be the coolest kid in the room. He wasn't fearless. He wasn't especially confident. Sometimes he even looked uncomfortable. But Harry Potter was never supposed to be fearless. He was supposed to be ordinary. Someone who felt completely unprepared and kept going anyway without realizing it. Daniel gave Harry something that couldn't be written into a script: vulnerability. And audiences connected with it immediately behind the cameras. He was still just another 11-year-old. He laughed between takes, forgot lines, played games with Rupert and Emma, ran around the set whenever nobody was filming. For the crew, this wasn't the future face of a billion-dollar franchise. It was just Daniel. Maybe that's the biggest reason the first movie still feels so genuine, because before Harry Potter became a global phenomenon, it was simply a group of adults trying to make sure 3 kids felt comfortable enough to tell a story. But success has a strange way of changing everything, and almost overnight, Daniel's life stopped belonging only to him. The first movie wasn't just a hit, it became a cultural event. Suddenly, the shy kid who almost never got the role was one of the most recognizable children on Earth. Magazine covers, television interviews, red carpets, fans waiting outside premieres. Everywhere Daniel went, people didn't see Daniel, they saw Harry. Imagine being 12 years old and realizing millions of strangers already feel like they know you. That's a kind of pressure most adults would struggle to handle. Never mind a child.
And the people I know, the people I have known for 3 or 4 years, sometimes call me Harry by accident. I don't know why.
Fame has ended careers. It's ended friendships. It's changed people forever. There was no guarantee Daniel would make it through 8 films still wanting to be Harry Potter. And yet, he did. Year after year, movie after movie. He kept showing up. He kept growing alongside the audience. And somehow, Harry grew with him. That may be the most extraordinary part of this story. Not that Warner Bros. Found the right 11-year-old, but that they found the right person. Because casting a child isn't really about choosing who they are today. It's about believing in who they'll become 10 years from now. That's a bet almost no studio ever gets right. Warner Bros. Did. And that's why, after all these years, it's almost impossible to picture anyone else wearing those glasses. Looking back now, it's easy to believe Daniel Radcliffe was the obvious choice, as if Warner Bros. Somehow knew exactly what they were doing from the very beginning. But that's not how history feels when you're living through it. Back then, there were no guarantees. No one knew if the movies would work. No one knew if audiences would accept an unknown 11-year-old. No one knew if that quiet kid from London could carry a story that millions of people had already imagined in their own minds. The only thing they had was a feeling that this was the right boy, and they were willing to bet everything on it. Think about how rare that really is. Studios spend hundreds of millions of dollars trying to eliminate risk. More famous actors, more familiar faces, safer decisions. Harry Potter did the exact opposite. Its biggest gamble was also its most important one, because they weren't choosing the biggest child star in Britain. They weren't choosing the safest option. They weren't even choosing the best young actor they had seen. They were choosing a future, one that didn't exist yet. They believed an ordinary 11-year-old could grow into someone the entire world would believe in. Not for one movie, for 10 years. That's an extraordinary leap of faith, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, they were right. Not because Daniel Radcliffe became Harry Potter, but because, over time, Harry Potter slowly became Daniel Radcliffe. The line between the character and the person faded with every film, with every birthday, with every premiere, until eventually millions of people couldn't imagine one without the other. Maybe that's what great casting really is. It's not finding the perfect actor. It's finding someone who disappears so completely into a character that, years later, you forget there was ever a choice to begin with. And maybe that's why this story still matters. Because for a few uncertain months, Harry Potter didn't exist. He wasn't waiting backstage. He wasn't hiding in another audition room. He wasn't guaranteed. He was just a possibility, one that almost slipped away before the world ever had the chance to meet him. Sometimes, movie history doesn't change because of the biggest decision. Sometimes, it changes because one ordinary family decides to say yes